If you think that I like vetoes, obviously I don't.
Abolishing veto is really the key ask.
Just before the 79th session of the UN General Assembly got underway, the US made a major announcement supporting a move for African countries to get at least 2 permanent seats on the UN Security Council. However, the US categorically said it does not want the African countries to enjoy the whole essence of the permanent seats, the veto power.
We don't want to give up our veto power, and we do think if we expand that veto power across the board, it will make the Council more dysfunctional.
The US position has angered African countries and their institutions, with many describing it as an insult to the continent.
Either Africa joins the UN Security Council and having veto power, or do not waste our time as Africans. We're sick and tired of this abuse. That needs to stop.
Why does this matter? Well, the UN Security Council, UNSC, is the most powerful body of the United Nations. The United Nations has 193 members, but only 5 countries are permanent members of the Security Council with veto power. They are the US, the UK, Russia, China, and France. Each of them has the right to reject any resolution that does not favor it, and that resolution becomes dead. Currently, no African country has this right.
I think it's ludicrous that the United Nations can seriously have a conversation, engage nations to debate on whether or not we should expand the UN Security Council, an issue that has been raised by global South countries for decades, an issue that Africa has been raising for decades, and now they want to insult us by saying, oh yes, you can become a member of the UN Security Council, but just come and sit at the table and remain mute like you have been for centuries. That is unacceptable.
Here is where it gets interesting. With 54 countries and a population of more than 1.5 billion, Africa has the largest voting bloc in the UN General Assembly, whose decisions are largely non-binding. African leaders are pushing for the continent to have permanent seats with veto power on the Security Council.
Placing the fate of the world's security in the hands of a select few when it is the vast majority of the peoples of the world who bear the brunt of the various threats is unjust, unfair, and unsustainable.
An institution that excludes 54 African countries with 1.4 billion people, while allowing one nation to veto decisions of the remaining 193 member states in the 21st century, is simply unacceptable.
Nearly 80 years after its creation, the Security Council has been stuck in time. Its imbalanced composition is unjust and at odds with current realities, undermining its legitimacy and effectiveness.
When the UN was established, most African countries were under repressive colonialism. Experts criticized the continued lopsidedness of the global body. Let us zoom out for a closer look at the United Nations Security Council, UNSC. The United Nations itself was established in 1945, just after the Second World War, with the primary responsibility of maintaining global peace and security, as well as preventing international wars. The idea was to avoid the mistakes of its predecessor, the League of Nations, which failed to prevent the Second World War. The Security Council is the most influential arm of the United Nations. It has 15 members, 5 permanent with veto power and 10 non-permanent without veto power. The non-permanent members are elected for 2-year terms by the General Assembly on a rotational basis among countries from the regional blocs in the UN. Currently, Africa has 3 non-permanent seats being occupied by Algeria, Sierra Leone, and Mozambique. Now, let's look at how powerful the Security Council is in the UN system. It's responsible for maintaining international peace and security. Its decisions are binding on UN members. It can step in during conflicts by sending peacekeeping missions. It uses diplomacy but can apply sanctions on a country or countries. It also has the power to approve peacekeeping operations and mediate disputes between nations. In some cases, it can even authorize the use of military force against an aggressor. But here's the kicker. If any one of the so-called P5 doesn't like a decision, it can just veto it, and the whole thing is dead in the water. No action, no progress.
It is critical that the pen holder power within the Security Council must be democratized. You cannot continue to have the P5, who also hold the nuclear button, have all the power of drafting and tabling resolutions.
Although it's the most powerful organ of the UN, the Security Council is also the most divided. Its members, particularly Russia, China, and the United States, frequently disagree and clash on major resolutions that could make huge impact. Some analysts say expanding the Council could bring some balance and make it more representative of the current world. It's important to mention that the issue of Africa's representation has been on the table for decades. In fact, Africa has a united stance on this, known as a Zulwini Consensus, named after a valley in central Eswatini, then known as Swaziland, where the agreement to seek UNSC seats for Africa was reached by the continent's leaders in 2005. This agreement calls for 2 permanent seats on the Council, with all the rights and privileges that come with permanent membership, including veto power. It also demands 5 non-permanent seats to ensure Africa has a stronger voice in global decision-making. African leaders say without veto power, permanent seats would just be symbolic, even if they are eventually granted. That wouldn't fix the deeper issues of real representation.
The legacy of colonialism, economic exploitation, and political marginalization has left deep scars on the African continent, thereby affecting its development, stability, and influence in international affairs. This results in a lack of meaningful representation on issues that directly affect the continent, such as conflict prevention, conflict resolution, peacekeeping operations, and sustainable development.
It's not only African countries that are pushing for the expansion of the UN Security Council. It's a growing global campaign.
A comprehensive reform is needed in the United Nations, especially in the Security Council. In fact, the world is bigger than 5. We need to democratize the decision-making procedure at the UN. The resolutions that are adopted with an overwhelming majority at the General Assembly cannot be implemented because of the Security Council. International peace and security cannot be left to the will of a privileged clique consisting of a limited number of countries.
To actually expand the UN Security Council, the UN Charter must be revised. Some say it's a difficult task, but not impossible. 2/3 of the General Assembly must agree, and all of the veto-holding members must be on board. The current UN chief, Antonio Guterres, sounds optimistic.
I think that it is easier to have an agreement on the expansion of the Council, on the new permanent members, and on a number of, I would say, improvements in the transparency and procedure of the Council, and in the increased role of the General Assembly. I think all those things are possible, and I'm hoping for progress in all of them. I am skeptical about the possibility to have an abolition of the veto. That doesn't mean, as I said, that I like it.
Africans have already started discussions about countries that should represent the continent and how to choose them if the seats are granted.
I don't think there'll be a problem having consensus. The African heads of states have been working together very well through the African Union. They can do it in a rotational way. They do it in terms of the chairman of the African Union. The Africans are used to looking at the continent according to regions, East Africa, North, South, West, Central. The Africans have a process on how they are going to do it. They'll put it in a rotational. I'm sure that's the way they're going to go. But I don't think African Union is going to have a problem coming up with 2 countries. It will be done in a very organized way, like African Union has done, on a rotational basis. I don't think that's an issue at all. It will be taken care of.
With the debates getting more heated internationally, experts believe that reforming the UN, including its Security Council, is inevitable with the rapid changes the world is witnessing. But it's difficult to say exactly when it will happen in line with Africa's demands.